90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is attorney Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today, we're talking with Darius Ross. He's a real estate owner and investor, and we're going to get perspective from him on what COVID has meant to the real estate market and what changes we can expect going forward in both residential and commercial real estate. Darius, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Attorney Landau, pleasure being here.
You have a unique perspective being an owner of commercial and residential properties, and like all of us being affected by the impact of COVID on real estate. So tell us in general how COVID has impacted tenants and business owners and landlords.
14 months ago, there was no indication that COVID would last 14 to 16 to now going into 2 years. And we're looking at an impact right now of in the trillions. It's unbelievable when you have going through Manhattan, for example, complete blocks that are devastated with no storefronts that are gone, 500,000 people that were impacted by the low income and moderate income jobs, thousands of women, 40 plus hotels that are now gone. Just looking at the magnitude of that to realize a city like Manhattan completely shut down for tourism. You know, we're looking at $1 billion a day on the average. Nobody thought about that. And then to realize that commercial real estate just completely plummeted. The complete devastation of people being at home. You know, this has never happened in the history of New York City, per se, even in the world. So now all of a sudden you have this reality check of, okay, owners now saying to themselves, I don't have rents, tenants without jobs or income. So now the reality check of it is what was supposed to happen. At the end of the day, there's no way to predict how this is going to play out. But one of the things that was for sure was that there was going to be some type of scenario that was going to have an impact of this magnitude at some point in time, whether it was going to be some issue that was going to be economic, like a stock market correction, and or what was going to be considered as the real estate market transition. But now here we are, and the transition is now what's next? That's the problem.
And it also was an invisible force of nature. It wasn't a bomb or an explosion or a flood. It was something in the air.
That's right. Because now when we look at the transition of this, 9/11 was a issue that was controlled and somewhat contained in the sense that at least there was a beginning and an end to it. You know, the disaster happened, and all of a sudden there was a couple of years later and New York City was moving back forward. Didn't happen like this here.
And this was something we had never experienced, and we still don't know how it's going to play out.
No.
And now some court cases have been held back because there's a freeze on evictions. There might be a freeze on bankruptcies. So the next act is still yet to be played out as we emerge from COVID, and court proceedings are allowed to expand. Companies are going to go bankrupt. And these may be companies who haven't paid their commercial or office rent, and individuals may be going bankrupt too, and maybe subject to eviction. And they've been protected as COVID plays out. So how do you think those dynamics are going to work?
Okay, let's give an example of the court system. The court system has never been completely shut down. That is a complete oddity. Attorneys have never been at home, not able to file briefs. So now when we look at the bankruptcy system, correct? We're looking at potentially speaking 10 million homeowners around the country. That's a huge number that are just in the position of forbearance. And the forbearance meaning their loans are on hold. It doesn't mean that they don't have to pay, because it means they're on hold. We have tenants, that 40 million tenants across the country, similar situation. They're not paying rent. Now, the problem with that is that the landlord's sitting there saying, I need money. And the city is still saying it's paying taxes. It's still saying you need to pay taxes and so forth. So now here's the court system that now, as soon as this moratorium ends in New York State, it's going to be August 31st. In other parts of the country, depending on how Mr. Biden, positions this, it's due to be July 31st, I believe. But the bottom line of it is there is going to be a huge tsunami of people rushing in the court system, which is going to create a major problem because the court's going to be flooded. Now, the problem with that is whether or not the tenants are going to be able to negotiate with their landlords and the homeowners are going to be able to negotiate with their lenders. But taking it one step further, the bankruptcy system is going to have to be either transitioned or some major changes because we're looking at millions of bankruptcies. This is unheard of.
The freeze on court proceedings may be extended. There might be some kind of intervention. There might be some type of slowing it down than the eviction tsunami that could be coming. And some businesses are still existing, but they're not paying rent. They're not taking in income. So they're on the verge of collapse if and when they have to pay rent. They're not sustainable in the long run. And some landlords and very big commercial owners may also be on thin ice because they've been protected, but they're not going to be able to make it over the next few months, especially if they don't have the income.
If I were to go in a crystal ball and be honest here, you're going to look at the real estate system right now where this is kind of funny. It's the dichotomy of something interesting. Real estate in the residential market is booming. I mean, it's the weirdest thing. 200, 300, 400% of houses are selling, right? At an exorbitant rate. But here's the problem. What's propping up the market? Guess what? The Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve actually now is beginning to take back some of those swaps, which are transitions into keeping the system in the market going. Now, what happens when the market actually no longer has all this extra money in it? We're looking at potentially speaking the real estate market taking a 60% dip. Now, what does that mean for commercial owners? A lot of wipeout.
And so, and also the housing market has been scarce because those homes in foreclosure where foreclosure's been frozen are not on the market.
Correct.
They will flood the market in a few months or next year when the foreclosures take place and there are evictions and those houses go back on the market, at least some segment of the market.
Well, that's what's going to really transition this to a different perspective. Now you have the foreclosed homes coming back on the market. And this is what's another tricky thing. You have private equity and hedge fund companies that have now bought homes in mass. So the first thing they're going to do when they start seeing the tailwinds changing, they're going to drop them back on the market. So prices are going to drop.
And do you think they may repurpose them as rental homes rather than trying to sell them and get some quick income as rental units or building some co-ops? So
you got to remember the business model. The business model is they have to turn around and have their investors in for 7 years. Right about now, we're in the midst of that crisis process. From 2008 until now, the last crisis, a lot of those hedge funds and private equity groups are now looking to position themselves to get out probably by 2022, 2023.
So is there going to be a race to the bottom? Before the question was how fast could rents and prices go up? Is it going to be the opposite? Is it how low can they go?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if I were to turn around and take a hedge bet, if you want to call it, Bitcoin was a good example of a disaster. So something that a week ago was 60,000, 30,000. If we look at the real estate market, we're looking at potentially speaking it being cut by 60%. So not only is it a race to the bottom, but how fast can you get out? It's like musical chairs.
And is the biggest drop going to be with retail stores? Because of the internet, there's going to be so many more stores vacant and large spaces vacant, let's say in Manhattan, where there are a few people living or working?
Actually, right now, you're already seeing the retail market take the biggest hit. Later on, it's just going to be the zombies. See, we haven't even talked about the zombie companies that are out there.
Now, when you say zombie companies, just explain what that means.
A company that basically has no revenue, it has revenue, but looks good on paper, correct? It has employees, looks good on paper. But at the end of the day, it has no revenue that actually is keeping the company going. So effectively speaking, that company is only functioning based upon either governmental subsidies or that company is functioning because it's basically buying its own dividends or it's functioning on its credit lines. So it's on a lifeline. All it needs to happen is for the economy to turn indifferent or for the government to snatch back its funding. It's done.
And at some point, mortgages are going to be snatched or mortgages are going to be foreclosed. As you said, the government is going to snatch funding, and so there's going to be a lot of turmoil in the residential market, the commercial market as well.
We're looking at in the mid 80s, there was something that was called Resolution Trust, and that was S&Ls being wiped out back in the day. We're looking at the Resolution Trust of grandmother, all Resolution Trust. We're looking at, potentially speaking, a systemic crisis that has not been talked about yet. It's like pretend and extend. If this doesn't end soon, it's going to be a nightmare.
And what are some of the solutions going forward? How are investors going to come in and try to buy, just pay a few cents on the dollar to buy some of this real estate, to rent it out, at some kind of profit, to resell it?
If we take this back to the 1920s, what actually has to happen, again, the companies have to be allowed to fail. You're going to have to allow for the loss of massive amount of homes. Just like it happened in Resolution Trust, you're going to have to take them back. The haircuts are going to be massive. It's actually going to be a systemic crisis because banks are going to fold up like they did in 2008. You're going to have these homes at probably pennies on the dollar, like you just said. I would say you'd probably be looking at a home for next to nothing.
Well, do you think the homes have fallen as much as commercial space, assuming the home's in some kind of condition, it can be rented out or resold? Has the residential market crumbled that much?
See, that's the
Or is it a
thing.
luxury building in Manhattan where no one wants to live anymore that's going to, really go down?
See, there's only so many millionaires in the world. That's the first problem. And you're not minting any new group of millionaires. So that's the first problem. So the luxury housing is ultimately speaking going to correct itself just by the cannibalism principle. The middle income market, which is those that are making less than 100,000, that's the real crisis point here, because they're actually looking at the middle income of middle America and the middle of the world. Middle class America has disappeared. So that's the real crux of this. There's no support system there. So these folks have now been hit the hardest. And COVID was just like the dynamite, but now the explosion hasn't happened yet because it hasn't really corrected itself. Until you actually go in and clean the system out and actually flush out these toxic mortgages and the derivatives and swaps, you can't clean it out.
So this is essentially a time bomb that's going to go off after COVID ends, after the stay on evictions and the stay on mortgages have ended. And as everyone's trying to foreclose properties, go ahead with evictions, and there'll be a whole bunch of new normals.
That's correct. What you're looking at now, until we actually have an end of stimulus, until we have an actual end to moratoriums, and until we actually have a situation where these mortgages are actually now put on the market as book value, realistically saying, okay, I've been a non-payer for the last 16 months. Where does that money go to? Are they going to put it on the back end? The banks are afraid. Right now, the bank's position we're just going to pretend this is not happening.
And the government's been propping up some of those payments for the moment, but that's going to stop.
Absolutely. They have to. Because unfortunately speaking, the government's credit line is gone too. Because interestingly enough, you're beginning to see now that the Federal Reserve's bonds and their bills are being bought by the Treasury. So how do you buy your own money?
I just want to remind our listeners that we're talking with Darius Ross, and he's an investor and a real estate broker and an owner of both commercial and residential property. And he's giving us his thoughts on what will happen to real estate, both commercial and residential, over the next few months as we emerge from COVID, and who's going to gain and what's going to crash. In terms of employment, do you think people will return to an employment state where they have income and can pay rents or pay mortgages, or that's also going to change forever as we emerge from COVID?
Here's an interesting thing. I've been upstate and I've been out of state looking at something. There are jobs. I mean, it's incredible. $18, $19, $20 an hour. People don't take the jobs. So we're at a point in time now, whereas thousands of companies can't get employees. So will it be returning? No, because unfortunately speaking, why would I want to leave a job that I was into, tech or retail or whatever I was doing, and go back to a service job? Not going to do it. So what you're seeing now is the revolting of America's people. They're looking at, okay, why should I have to go to work for less than what I've known when first I went to business? I'm doing well on unemployment. in the sense of, I don't have to deal with the nonsense. Not saying that unemployment is the best avenue, but they don't have to deal with the nonsense of that job. And on the other hand, why would I go a step down to a job that makes no sense? So retooling America is going to take a while.
And how will that retooling come about? And what do you mean by retooling?
We're going to have to look at somewhat like President Roosevelt did with the New Deal. We're going to have a new deal in jobs, which means that you're going to have to spend a lot of time in educational services creating programs that are going to allow Americans to turn around and be able to deal with the job market and the technical side of things. Because there's a huge scenario, if you want to call it, of jobs in the tech area, in the advanced service area, but that's not in what's happening in America now. Most of these jobs are service sector.
So do you think if we can transition people who are not working into tech jobs, teach them that, they'll be able to earn more money and in turn pay money to rent or buy real estate?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the big things I did was I was a proponent with the group that I have been a member of, Responsible Wealth, and we pushed for the minimum wage. But here's what happened. We walk into a McDonald's, we push for $15 an hour in New York State. You walk into a McDonald's, the hamburger now is almost, if a meal for two is $25. So all of a sudden we got the minimum wage, but then the price of the food went up to such a point where they can't afford it. So now if you get these technical jobs, then you're taking away from the fact that these people can't afford to eat, sleep, and so forth. Because when I looked at it, just the numbers game, in New York City, it takes you about $5,000 per month to live on the average. Well, what kind of employment did it give you? You've got to make at least $70,000, taking away taxes and so forth. So where does that put you at?
So the opportunities may be there for those people who are ambitious to make the jump into some kind of higher level work so they can earn more money, so they can rent or buy some kind of real estate. Absolutely. Okay.
But that means that we're going to have to change the dynamics of the minimum wage. We're going to be looking at a minimum wage of at least $40 an hour to just keep up. And see, that's what's unrealistic. People are going to be like, $40 an hour, I'm not going to pay that.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if for the tech jobs they're going to get $40 an hour.
Exactly.
And what about the homeless crisis? We've been talking about the haves or the have little. What about the people who are homeless? How's that impacting on real estate, the quality of life, and finding a way to give them a better situation?
Okay, here's a good example of the homeless crisis. There was a photo that was taken of a gentleman that was actually outside of a hotel when this whole thing began. And I was talking to some friends. I said, you know why he's outside that hotel? He feels safer there than any other place. He doesn't even want to be inside the hotel because he's in fear. So now think about that. He's at the front door of a hotel and he's rather sleeping outside than go inside. Now, to put that into perspective, we have a situation where you have probably 4 or 5 million plus apartments in New York City, let's just say. So with that being said, how many of those apartments are affordable? Because it goes back to the process of employment. If they can't afford to stay there, you're going to have a bunch of people piling up in housing, almost like when you look at public housing. So you've got a bunch of people that are piling up inside a house. So you've got 7 people. It takes 7 people to pay one rent. It's unrealistic. So again, as landlords, we're going to have to take a different position because in order for us to get the rent, we have to say, okay, we want, especially in subsidized housing, tax credit, Mitchell Lamas. There are rules that say what you can and can't do. But now those rules are going to have to be bent or the people are going to bend in one way or the other, or we're going to have a massive homeless crisis. I mean, that's the reality to it. A lot of people that are homeless are not jobless. They just can't afford the rent in New York City, Chicago, and LA. That's reality. And it's getting that way around the country. You know, the average rent's about $1,200 for a 1-bedroom. That's unrealistic for somebody making less than $15 an hour.
In terms of the, let's say, the residential real estate, the middle market, and the, let's say, the luxury market in the city, what will happen to that market and co-ops and condos as we go forward in the next few months and go past beyond COVID?
Here's a good scenario. The carnage that's going to happen with the middle class having its legs taken out from under it. What nobody's understanding is New York City is based upon a lower income and a moderate income supporting everyone else. So all the rest of us at a certain income level over 100,000 are supported by those that make less than that. So if all of a sudden they're no longer here, what's going to happen with garbage collection, the police department, and as we see the violence that's going on now? People aren't necessarily all violent because, okay, I just want to go out there and hurt somebody. A lot of these people are hurting because they're trying to figure out what do I do next? The violence is brought on a lot of times by the conditions of the circumstances of what they're dealing with. So what we're going to be looking at is more people that are, unfortunately speaking, going to be impacted, because as more jobs begin to leave the areas and the impact begins to be felt, a lot of those folks that were comfortable are going to become uncomfortable because they can't afford to stay here. It's just a matter.
People who are very comfortable, are they going to return to New York, or are they going to stay in their house in the Hamptons or look for a house upstate, and their dollars will be lost to the New York economy?
Well, see, that's another big question. Right now, because of COVID, that was a big push. But now the bigger issue has become they have now bought properties upstate. They bought properties in Connecticut and Rhode Island and so forth. Now the question becomes, can they afford to maintain being between duality, two different spaces? They've got a place here that they didn't sell, they just walked away from, and the house they have there, the apartment they have there. Can they maintain that from a financial basis? Particularly speaking, when the economy, as we look at it now, we're in a recession that's just not being called, okay? Because theoretically speaking, if you're pulling in, say, $300,000 a year, but a lot of that $300,000 is based upon middle or low income folks that were buying these services, you got a problem too. So I don't see it coming back the way people thought.
I'd just like to remind our listeners that we're talking to Darius Ross. As you can hear, he's a real estate owner and investor, and a landlord and a real estate broker. And he's giving us his thoughts on what will continue to happen after COVID in the commercial and residential and the retail markets in New York City and the suburbs. We've just we're in the process of electing a new mayor in New York. Do you think that will have an impact? And what needs to be done politically to keep the market from crashing, to keep businesses and tenants in New York to support the various retail and entertainment venues in the city?
We're going to have a similar situation that happened with Mr. Rockefeller and what was going on at the time in the 70s, when there was a need to turn around for business to create a coalition to say we have to save the city. So unfortunately speaking, and or fortunately speaking, businesses are now going, especially large corporations, are going to have to dip into their tills and say, we're going to have to keep this thing propped up and create social service programs, philanthropic programs, as well as economic programs to keep the city running. Because if not, as a mayor, you're going to have to be looking at this tactically and strategically. It's almost like logistic nightmare when it comes to bringing the city back, because so many things have gone wrong. And now in order to get them back right, you've got to go at this thing by saying to the business leaders, I need your help. I need your help. I need your pocketbook too. And I need your, resources and boots on the ground to make this come about.
And does that bring up an important quality of life issue to get people to return to work in the city, to return to living in the city, to come in the city for culture, that there's got to be some intervention to help the homeless in some way, to keep crime down, to improve cleanliness in order to keep those dollars coming into the city? Are they all related?
I'll give you a good example. It is all intertwined. I'll give you a good example. I've been talking about this for years, and it's one of the programs I've been trying to work on. We have a $92 trillion series of investors all over the world that actually have headquarters here. And if we take a tenth of that and say, listen, we need to turn around and do something here in New York. This model program can be taken around the country, but more importantly speaking, right here in New York, if you say, okay, a tenth of those dividends are put back in here to help mental illness, to provide housing, to provide some type of services to make this thing go away. It's not going to completely go away, but we can kill 80 or 90% of it. And kill is the wrong word, but we can diminish 80 or 90% of it to whereas these folks can begin to lead at least normal life. And people that are counterproductive, they can be incarcerated if necessary. But more importantly speaking, the normality can come back. So institutional money has to be money on the table. I mean, like I said, boots on the ground. You got to get in here and put your pockets in.
Okay. Darius, tell us about some of the books you have out and articles that you have out about real estate.
Right now, I've got 3 books that are coming out this fall. It's the top 100 locales for investing in post-COVID real estate. The other one is Strategic Real Estate Investing for the Novice 2021 and Beyond. And the third one is coming out in October, which is Prepare, Participate, and Profit from Post-COVID Investing.
And can a listener find out information about the books on your website? And just please,
absolutely,
website.
DariusRoss.com.
Okay, and that's DariusRoss.com.
Yes, sir.
And a year from in the summer of 2022, where do you think New York and the suburbs will be in terms of real estate?
If New York City and the new mayor actually makes dynamic and strategic moves and handle this almost as if he's handling it like a logistics scenario of occupation, and makes and pushes and arms twist the leaders, New York City will begin to see itself come back to somewhat of a normality. I mean, it's going to take time. I'd say it's going to be 7 or 8 years out. The suburban New York, the only issue there is bringing those individuals that are from the suburban areas into the city to start spending more money, because now it's been a lot of fear. And that fear has to be diminished by the fact that what's going on in the city.
And this is true in many other cities around the country,
but
New York has always been the exception to have a vibrant economic engine in its downtown because of its culture. So the question is if we're going to get back to that reality.
It will come back, which it always has. But the issue of the hour is, one of the things that was interesting is Mayor Bloomberg did a really interesting thing because the city was at its safest during those times. Unfortunately speaking, what has to happen now is you have to get containment of how the city is being operated, particularly speaking from the policing department. These areas have to be dealt with in such a way whereas people aren't walking around and afraid of being slashed and hurt and on, and they can function, because that's the biggest problem. People are in fear right now, even on the trains.
And so we need a little bit law and order to make all this work.
Absolutely. I'm not saying it has to be overkill, because that's been one of the biggest problems. It's been too hard-handed necessarily, but it's like more of a community policing where you have to turn around and some of the people that are from those communities need to be in those communities to work with the community leaders and find out where the problems are.
And we need to help them in order to help the real estate industry and everything else in New York.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes hand in hand. Hospitality, law enforcement, retail, service sector, everything goes hand in hand. So those leaders need to actually sit down and come together and kind of, create a coalition to make this work.
Okay. I'd like to thank Darius Ross for being our guest and talk about real estate and foreclosure after COVID, and look up his books. And if you missed any part of the show or you want to tell someone else about it, you can find the podcast at nccradio.org. And please join us next week at this same time on 90.3 WHPC FM in Garden City, Long Island, New York, for another program on Law You Should Know.